one of the major announcements in the 19th Congress was the changing of the primary contradiction from backward productive forces and the people's desire for a better life to unbalanced and unequal development and people's desire for a better life. So there was an explicit theoretical prioritization of reducing inequality and to creating a more level economy in terms of unequal between East and West, between rural and urban, between Han and ethnic minority areas. So there's tons and tons of policy in that regard that flows down from the theoretical development of the CPC. And so that's one of the reasons why there has been such a big campaign and a big push in this direction in recent years.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm really glad you brought up the contradictions and primary contradictions, because one thing that China does, which is like another way of like their application of Maoism and Marxism, is that every so often they understand that as China evolves, the conditions within China evolve, and along with those, the different primary contradictions, right? So the primary contradiction under like during Mao's period was class struggle, and then during Deng's period, it was backward social productivity versus people's material needs. And as you just mentioned, the CPC recently announced that the primary contradiction now is uneven development, particularly between the rural and the urban areas, which, is part of the reason why they're undertaking these kinds of poverty alleviation programs. And in 2017, she announced that China had passed a new milestone in that socialism with Chinese characteristics had entered a new era, which meant making progress in achieving a moderately prosperous society. First of all, can you discuss what is meant by socialism with Chinese characteristics, which characterizes China's guiding principle post-1979, and how this differs from the period of Mao Zedong Thought, which came before it, and how all these periods are informed by but different from Marxism-Leninism?
Well, I mean, I would say it's a unbroken theoretical line.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with Marxism-Leninism, then goes to Mao Zedong Thought, then to Deng Xiaoping theory, then three represents under Jiang Zemin, scientific outlook on development under Hu Jintao, and then the Xi Jinping thought on the Chinese socialism and Chinese characteristics for a new era. So I mean, they're not wholesale abandoning any link in that chain, right? It's all a theoretical development based on the conditions of China at the time. In terms of what socialism and Chinese characteristics means, I would say it's also pretty Marxist in its orientation. It's this idea that you cannot dogmatically apply the conditions of one country to another, right? You can't take what worked in the Soviet Union, for example, and try to sort of shoehorn it onto a country like China, for example, because their class conditions are different, their material conditions are different. You can't have. It's difficult to have a Soviet-style revolution of the urban proletariat if you're a semi-feudal, mostly rural economy with an enormous peasantry and a very small urban proletariat in a country that has semi-industrialized, if that, right? I mean, like China had been held back from industrialization by the century of humiliation and the occupation by imperial powers and the looting of its resources, and so that came at the exact wrong time for China to be in the same developmental position as the West, despite having been an economic leader in the world for so many centuries before, right? Because the Industrial Revolution kickstarted development and changed the world, right? I mean, that's the basis for capitalism. It's what grew into what we now understand to be the need for socialism. And so this idea of China having its own conditions, having its own needs and its own struggles, and the application of the theoretical principles that work for China's conditions, and the disuse of those that don't. And so that started from the revolution, right? I mean, because the revolution was about encircling the cities from the countryside and mobilizing the peasantry, which the Soviets did not think could be done. And so there was a certain degree of skepticism toward the CPC in terms of what it was doing to make revolution, because they didn't believe the peasantry was like the class with the most revolutionary potential. And so for a time, the CPC was attempting to, again, dogmatically copy and paste the Soviet strategy, and it wasn't working. And so the development of the theory, one of the things that Mao Zedong thought is about the peasantry, right? In a country like China, you can mobilize, radicalize the peasantry. It might not be possible for the lumpen or a peasant-like class in an advanced industrial nation, but it's possible for a rural society like China's. And so that was one advancement of the theory, without abandoning the basic principles of Marxism-Leninism, right? The need for a communist party, the need for democratic centralism, the need for an organized fighting force of the working class made up of its most advanced elements. Like, that was all there. That didn't go away. So I would say that that's the advancement, and that continues to the present day, right? As the conditions change, the theory changes, and as the theory changes, it's a dialectical kind of process of theory and practice meeting. And so the notion of, people like to talk about there being like a break, right, between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, right? And you mentioned earlier the Mao Zedong headline comparisons, which really are only being leveraged because people that write these headlines and write these stories don't think about Mao Zedong in terms of what he actually said or what he actually believed or what he actually wrote, because they haven't read it, they don't care. They just think of him as bad guy. You can replace any use of Mao Zedong in a headline with bad guy, and that's what they're doing. There's no actual thought. There's no actual thought toward what he said or wanted or meant to achieve. It's just, we're just reminding you of bad thing. Remember the bad thing? It's bad. And so that's also the byproduct of that is what creates the need to have a break, right? Because if China under the CPC is bad thing and Mao Zedong is bad thing, then why did the U.S. officially recognize it and warm relations to a degree and integrate with its economy, right? So that's the boogeyman, one of many boogeymen that they use. As far as I would say that the break is overstated. I don't think there was a theoretical break. I think there was a disagreement over the applications of the theory in the form of like the Cultural Revolution, which you could argue was an attempt to radically reorient the relations of production just without the productive forces being developed to the level where you could do that, right? So that was a disagreement in terms of the applications of Marxist theory, but it wasn't a disagreement in terms of the basics of Marxist theory, right? The idea that socialization of production and socialization of the productive forces does lead to a change in the relations of production, but the question is how and how fast and to what extent and all this sort of thing. So I mean, I think the theory is still where it was in the basics. In terms of the application to China, it's about the development of a market economy, an economy that is marketized to a degree, but while still having the decisive role in the economy, the decisive sectors of the economy being organized on the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their work, which was the old Soviet paradigm and is the paradigm for the value of labor in what China refers to as its primary stage of socialism. So you have the state-owned economy, the state-owned enterprises working on this principle still. And though there is a large, somewhat private, I mean, the degree to which it's private, I think is debatable, but nominally private economy that operates on traditional profit seeking, they do not have the decisive reins on the economy. They don't have the key industries. They don't have the kind of important industry that would allow them to create an industrial capitalist power base, right? So it's not just about marketizing to kickstart productive forces and boost development. It's also about preventing whatever nascent capitalist class forms as a result of this from consolidating itself into a class that acts on its own behalf, right? That's the difference between what a class is and what just some rich guy is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some rich guy is just some rich guy. But if there's a group of rich guys that have enough wealth and enough power to consolidate and to have their own class consciousness, right, that they can act as a force to better immiserate the working class, that makes them a class, right? The same way that a working class is kind of unformed and embryonic until it gains that consciousness, right? Because you have to have, and that's what a party is for. It's for disciplining and educating and organizing that class. Until then, you just have a bunch of people. And so there are differences, of course. I mean, the degree to which there is our market forces determining value does exist, but it's a question of what controls are leveraged on that system, on those mechanisms. What are the limits of those market forces? What is the ability of the state and of public interest to trump the interests of profit? And there's always plenty of examples to look toward when it comes to China of public interest being higher than private profit making. And so for me, there are differences between China now and China in 1949 or 66 or 78. But I think that based on, and again, right, the situation of 78 was such that China had its split with the Soviet Union. They considered them social imperialists. They understood at that point that there was a need for boosting productive forces because, in the traditional Marxist sense of having a bourgeois revolution, having a period of capitalism, to increase, to widen the scope of the economy and to increase resources so that they can be distributed more equally, right? So also there was this idea of having the bourgeois revolution within the framework of a socialist revolution, because they had that in 49, and then building up this Marxist system under those constraints theoretically would mean that you had levels of control you wouldn't have in a system where the bourgeois revolution was also the state revolution, right? Where the capitalist class formed the state, which happened in the United States, which happened in much of Europe. The revolution was on behalf of the property holders and the landowners and taking power away from the aristocrats and the monarchs, but still consolidating their power within the mechanisms of the state. Whereas the socialist revolution had the working class constituting its powers within the mechanism of the state, and that state not having been overthrown or destroyed. And so you're able to then you're able to have the conditions for a controlled bourgeois revolution that does create wealthy people, but also prevents them from organizing themselves as an alternate power structure, and prevents them from destroying the gains that have been made in the socialist revolution. So, I mean, there's a lot, and of course there's disagreement about that. Not everybody thinks that, and that's fine, but that's where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm.